Paul. I just wanted to get a moment to get your perspective to help guide our team of analysts. So, with Trump signaling a sharper stance on the tariffs, again, particularly around China, there's quite a bit of movement across Asia. Some economies are positioning themselves to capture any supply chain realignment, but others look more exposed, especially around those tied to the Chinese manufacturing or those that are heavily reliant on the US demand. So I just wanted to get your view on a few fronts. How do you see this playing out in terms of America's global position?
Well, look, let me give a contrarian view to what you're reading, Raga. Okay, and it's really important that our analysts see this from the left field and the right field, not from the popular field. I see this as a major catalyst to who has hegemonic power or who becomes a power sharing country without realizing that's where they're taking themselves and who ultimately is going to have power. So there's short, medium, and long term impacts of this, let's call it what it is, a tariff warfare, a Cold War this time under the guise of trade. The states have obviously gone and heralded these tariffs, and Trump is trying to explain it as trade inequalities. Really, economically, what he's doing is extremely naive. I think everybody knows that. What he's trying to do is force people into a decision of following the states, putting their money to the safe haven currency. This is backfiring on him. And that's why it's accelerating short, medium, and long term unintended consequences. The relationship on the yields on bonds and the US dollar movements clearly show that we're seeing a monumental change in global power. People or countries or economies that Trump expected to move funds, take bond positions towards the states isn't occurring, which is why he's pretending now to have a 90-day pause, reevaluate, and cut deals. The problem is China stepped in and said, we're going to match the tariffs. So they're playing a really hard negotiation game. And they've said, if other countries cut a deal with the states, you're making a decision to side with the states and not side with us. In harming us, you're making a decision now. Obviously, there's a saying coined by one of the great presidents that the only thing more dangerous than being an being an enemy of the states is being an ally. The states is now going to try to nestle up against India, and India's not going to have a bar of it. They're too independent, they're too proud a nation, and they've seen too many examples of the states running its own race at the expense of others. Well, America's got a massive problem here because it's involved in so many wars which it pretends otherwise, but it tries to change political power in nations, and it tries to use arms as a bluff and as an active weapon. So you've got, Afghanistan, we're bordering on Iran, Iraq, Ukraine, Yemen, potentially Syria escalates, blindly following Israel into a lot of these wars, which aren't actually America's wars per se, but oligarchs, global oligarchs, and Zionist powers, particularly those with lots of money, have got America and indeed Trump and any president into a position of doing things their way. One of the things we have to understand is China's resilience. China only exports about 15% of its products to America. The USA only exports about 8% to China. But China exports $500 odd billion to the USA. However, keep that in perspective, it's only 15% of their exports. So between the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS networks and the Belt and Road Initiative, clearly what they've got is the ability to be more resilient and not be dependent on America's actions. That combined with the unusual effect that the yields and the linkage to the US dollars isn't going where it thinks it's going, shows that China's got a position now to say, okay, you wanted to make some moves against us. We've got a massive advantage over you. We have this thing called one dude in charge for life. So the head of China, he controls the economy, the companies, the central bank, so that he can move levers to manage the economy that simply America can't. America's greatest benefit is also its greatest weakness, and that is the amount of democratic voting. Midterms are going to be monumental because if there's a popularity shift, which there is on paper now, but if that popularity shift against Trump materializes, you're going to have Republicans starting to position themselves in fear of losing power in the next election. So we're in a position where American democracy only has one option, and that's to go back to the State Department, sorry, back to the Democrats. And the Democrats are the forever wars and, back into wokeism and stuff that is extremely inefficient and fails to cater for mainstream Americans. So then we have this pendulum swinging where Americans go, I'm not really interested in all these left wing agendas and wokeism. And these wars I don't really understand, and nobody's looking after me. So we're not getting an extended period of wise leadership that overcomes a lot of the problems inherent in too big a public service in America. And of course, they brought in Musk to change the efficiencies in the public service. Well, you can't. You can't set up a separate department and change those efficiencies. You have to engage with each department, and that is a long process. And it's against their desire to be unaccountable and earn large incomes. The cost of the American economy is such that even cutting your entire public service is not a significant cost compared to all the payouts that you're making. One of the real problems America's got now is it's spending more money on servicing its debt for forever wars in other countries and paying a public service which is pretty inefficient than it's spending on its own defence budget. And if you wind that clock forward several years, that's going to be worse. So they've decided they want to, force people into tariffs and on the guise of addressing trade inequalities. But the reality is they're wanting yields and bonds to give them money so that they can service this debt. And that's backfiring. So we're in a monumental state of shift. And short, medium term, as I mentioned, short term, a lot of discomfort, a lot of economies scrambling, including America, trying to work out, hey, what did I just do? Oh, I wasn't expecting that. Unintended consequences are really hurting. We need to reevaluate, but I need to look like a strong henchman. And when he's so fundamentally flawed in economic understanding, it's a grave concern. If you look at the alternate, the Democrats, they're worse. Medium term, we're going to see countries forced into making a decision, be blindly pro-America because it used to work, or is that now changing? We can no longer trust them to be a responsible, stable power, and we need to put safety elsewhere, gold, silver, and other relationships, i.e., aligning with China and other blocs. And on the long term, I think this is going to prove to be a major catalyst in America's loss of hegemonic power. They forced themselves into too many wars. They forced themselves down a path of tariffs for which, perhaps there was a 10-minute meeting over coffee where he thought, oh, that's a great idea, I'm going to run with that and be a legend and everyone will remember me on how great I was. But I think in history it's going to be remembered for a failure of understanding economics and broader relationships. And it's going to be remembering Trump as the guy that failed Economics 101. Raga, any other queries?
Yes, Paul. So, like you said, there is that huge skew between the Chinese exports to the US versus the US exports to China. So, do you think these tariffs are more likely to constrain China, or could they give it more room to adapt and pivot in a different direction and ban few alliances together that we probably didn't see coming.
Yeah, that's how I see it. I see that China has more resilience. It can maneuver more quickly. President Xi can basically enable an alignment and a negotiation process much more quickly. So he's in a position where he can maneuver and make decisions. And the two key things that are going to come out of this has increased the chance that there's going to be a blockade around Taiwan. Taiwan obviously exports extremely sophisticated semiconductors. China's already said, you want to play tariffs? Let us stop exporting rare earth minerals to you. Let us potentially consider putting a blockade around Taiwan so you can't get um, semiconductors. And as a result, they've got an ability to create leverage against America where they can't get rare earth minerals, they can't get semiconductors. And despite on the surface Trump trying to be popular to his voter base, hey, I'm going to punish China and make you all rich and we'll have manufacturing again. I mean, the last time we saw this was in the 1930s, where there were such powerful tariffs. America tried to lead global free trade. Now it's going, hey, let's wind the clock back and almost do a China and shut the rest of the world off. We don't need free trade. Well, you know, they've made an exception on computers and handphones, but when Americans have to pay more money because Chuck in Illinois earns a lot more money than Xinglong Ding in Shanghai producing a car, the realities of this is it's going against Trump's ability to hold this together from an internal popularity state. He's totally just failed to read the tea leaves economically on what is practical and what isn't. And the oversimplification of, hey, you've got this much trade surplus with this, so I'm going to punch you in the face. Where China's extremely resilient and able to move elsewhere. And they can even quickly shift the nature of their production and trade partners. So I think we're seeing a monumental catalyst to change in terms of the world's power balance. Throw into that all those aforementioned wars and all the current wars, Israel, human rights record, at some point America is going to be linked to that. Of course, it can force the UN to tell everybody they're okay, but you can only force stuff down people's throats so long. Unintended consequences of people build relationships elsewhere. If you look at the UK, Australia, we've supported America in every war since Vietnam, and we've got tariffs. And they're, in Australia's case, we are absurdly over reliant on China, and that doesn't reflect well on the wisdom of our own politicians that only really care about their own pay packets and their own lack of accountability to get an inflated salary. But we are so overly dependent on China that America, anything they do to China, any downturn in the Chinese economy affects Australia. Now, Australia, fortunately for America, is blind and not able to see left or right or outside of the pre-prescribed box. But a lot of other nations, particularly in ASEAN, in the Middle East, in Africa, even in Europe, as we've seen with Turkey and Hungary, countries are now going, hey, you know what? We need to run a race based on values, ethics, and common sense for our own economy. And we can no longer follow a country that's making decisions they don't even understand the consequences of. And I'm referring to that not only on the tariffs, but on the expense of the wars they're financing globally. And not only are they financing those wars to try and win it for their own outcome, for America's gain, the unintended consequence of that is enemies, both direct and indirect, observing countries are going, this isn't something we want to, a nation we want to be aligned with. And that's the sad unintended consequence of ill-considered decisions, particularly in a case where you have a president who's a real estate mogul and a popular guy on a reality TV show suddenly having a second crack at the wheels of power and perhaps not learning from his first failure, oversimplifying the reasons for previous failures. Now, that said, I was so happy and optimistic about Trump's second crack at it. But the way he's going about his second term, well within his 100 days, he's showing a total inability to be a leader. I still think America needed change. The Democrats were way out of control in starting wars, maintaining wars, sticking by frigid old leadership, no ability to see the everyday man's requirements, the everyday person's requirements through the states beyond the upper class dudes in DC and their affiliates in the Democrat Party. But this change is, a monumental failure in terms of how Trump's going about running what is at the moment primacy power nation.
Right. Thanks so much, Paul, for lending your insights and looking forward to helping our team refine their analysis.
Yeah, and look, it's important that we all get this, and those analysts, individual analysts, feel free to, on our dialogue box, just ask more questions because it's important that we see both sides of the power. We can't show a unbiased conscience that enables us to only see left or right or China or America. We really need to understand this because if companies are making risk management decisions now that aren't linked to commercial outcomes of their business, and everything we've said today is a precursor to that, making sure companies that are our members aren't having risk as a security thing. It needs to be an enabler for their businesses to be agile and think in advance on how this is going to affect their businesses. So thank you, Raga. And feel free, have a listen to it, make sure there's nothing too overly sensitive, but feel free to post this on LinkedIn and or to our clients because it's hard to hear, particularly for some of our American clients, but everybody needs to hear this. Our job isn't to be popular. Our job is to help them manage emerging risks and emerging opportunities accordingly so that they can improve business outcomes. Okay?
Sure, Paul. Thanks a lot.
Cheers, Ray. Bye-bye. Thank you.